Why does learning a language seem so much harder for an adult than it does for a child? Maybe you've experienced this. You've moved somewhere new and you've barely got your head around ordering a coffee, but your 5-year-old can already have full-blown conversations. There are many theories as to why this is, but there is one factor that I don't hear people talking about very often, and in my experience teaching Portuguese to adults, it is huge. It's the fear of failure and the shame that goes with that. So if you've been beating yourself up because you haven't been making enough progress in your language learning and you've chalked it up to being too old to learn, then I think you are going to love this conversation that I am having today with one of my greatest friends who also happens to be a licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Therese Mascardo. We're going to discuss what's actually going on in our brains when we are learning a new language to hopefully give you a shift in perspective and give you the confidence that you need to dive in. Let's go. So welcome, Therese. So today we're trying to get our head around why it seems so much more difficult for adults to learn languages than it is for children. What is the difference between our brains as adults and children, and is there anything to this theory?
Children's brains are totally different from adult brains, and in fact, a word that many people have heard is neuroplasticity or brain plasticity, which basically means the brain's ability to learn new things, take on new information, change, and grow. And in fact, children up until the age of 2 have double the amount of neural connections than adults do.
Okay.
And so what this means is that their brains are primed to take on new information and to learn new things, which makes a lot of sense because kids are trying to learn about the world, learn colors and shapes, and of course language. And also adults, because our brains are more formed, it's kind of like a foundation with a home that's built on it. There's structures in place, there's things that we've learned, and the kid's brain is completely different. It's like a foundation of a home with nothing built on it. So it creates kind of this like free reign for them to, kind of like a blank canvas for them to build upon, if it's okay for me to like mix metaphors.
Okay, so for kids, they've got this whole blank canvas. It's easy for them to build blocks, but for us, because we have all this knowledge and stuff already in there, it's hard to find the way. So you mentioned, so we do have clear evidence then for it being easier for children. But the word you mentioned there, neuroplasticity, it made me think of something that I always talk about with my students in the beginning when we start learning together, of how we're trying to actually build these new pathways in our brain, right? Why does getting from A to B and learning something new, why does that feel so much harder as an adult?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so the first thing that we should point out is that where learning happens in the frontal lobes, or also known as the frontal cortex, that part of the brain is still growing in children, whereas for adults after the age of 25, that part of our brain is pretty much fixed.
Okay.
And so for kids, this is why we call them sponges, because so much of their brain is still growing and learning how to take in information for the world. As adults, when we talk about learning new things and what the learning process is like, I go over this with my clients a lot when we're trying to learn a new skill. So imagine that you're trying to travel down a country road, right? A road that hasn't been taken very many times before. It's going to be bumpier and slower and not as efficient. But the more time you travel down a path, or in this case for learning languages, the more time you repeat it and really get that practice, then that pathway, that road becomes more efficient. So in other words, it becomes faster, it becomes easier, kind of like a highway. So new learning is like a country road, and after you've repeated and learned something again and again, it becomes easier, like a highway. And I'm sure many people can relate to that. After you do something a lot, it gets easier.
Yeah. But as adults, and this is the thing that I mentioned at the beginning in the introduction, something that I see coming up time and time again with my students, it's actually fear of failure that's holding them back. And I think as adults, that's something we're so much more aware of.
Totally.
Why is that? Why do kids not have this kind of shame or fear of failure when they're learning something new?
We have that phrase too, right? Like they have no shame. Shame is something that's learned. Believe it or not, when we're born, when we're babies entering the world, we don't come in thinking thoughts, having negative thoughts about ourselves, like I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I can't. Kids don't have any of that baggage. And so as adults, as many of us experience over time, you start to hang on to these messages, or in mental health, we call them thought distortions. They're lies that we believe about ourselves, and we all have them. And these lies, these limiting beliefs, these thought distortions, they get in our way from when we're trying to do things that we want to do. And thought distortions are really debilitating. And here's a really interesting thing. When shame or fear is activated in our brain, it turns on a different part of our brain than where we learn. So we learn in the frontal lobes. Fear and anxiety and shame exists in the amygdala.
Okay.
The amygdala is kind of like the fear center of the brain. And it seems really annoying when you're trying to do something like learn a language, but it's really a useful survival function. So when the amygdala is activated, we go into survival mode.
Right.
And that's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn.
Okay, so you said the word freeze, and
Yes.
that is a word that so many students will relate to as when they are getting to the front of the line and they need to say something and they freeze. So that's our amygdala working in action.
It's doing its job. It's actually doing what it's supposed to, which is that you're experiencing a threat and it's trying to keep you safe. And this is your brain's way of doing what it thinks will help you when you're experiencing a threat.
Right, but if we're trying to learn a language and we're trying to recall things that we've learned, it's in this other part of our brain that we can't get to because the amygdala is working overtime.
It is not good to have your amygdala show up when you're in a situation where you're trying to learn something new or speak a language or practice.
What can we do to quieten down that part of our brain that's taking over, making us panic, and fire back up the one that we need to actually speak a language?
Great question. There are some really simple things that everyone can do. One of the easiest to access is just by managing our breath. So when we're scared and panicky, typically we kind of hyperventilate a little bit. And so that's very short, quick breathing, kind of like that. And so, as you can imagine, the way to overcome that is to slow it down. And a good diaphragmatic breath or two can work wonders. So that's really just breathing from the very bottom of your abdomen with a nice slow exhale, just like that. And doing like 2 or 3 of those, or maybe more if you're really anxious.
So basically, when you're in the queue and it's almost your turn, you need to be deep breathing on the way up there so that by the time you get there to speak, you're calmer.
Yeah, this is what I do. I mean, I repeat everything I'm going to say a lot, and then I do some deep breathing, and it can help you to just feel a little less panicky. The second tip is something that most people have heard of, visualization.
Okay.
And in this case, by visualization, I mean picturing a certain scenario in your mind and almost using it as if you're practicing that as you think about it in your mind, or repeating it again and again. So, for example, if you've heard of Michael Phelps, he's an Olympic athlete, won a ton of awards. He would practice visualizing his swims again and again and again. And he would even picture like if something didn't go quite right.
Right.
And then in his brain, he tried to think of how he would maneuver out of that situation.
Okay.
So when it comes to language, visualize the situation that you're in. If you're anxious about the post office, for example, picture yourself walking up to the post office, picture yourself taking a seña, approaching the person that works at the counter, what you would say, and actually see it in your mind's eye using all 5 senses.
Okay.
The more that you can go into detail about the visualization, the more accurate it is, because your brain will really start to think that it's almost as if it's really happening.
Yeah. That's fascinating. That's really, really helpful, because this is what I tell my students all the time. I always get them to read aloud, or even do a recording. They send me recordings every week, and just pressing play and pretending that they are already in this situation. It really does it's like doing a simulation, right?
Exactly.
And so you have those feelings, and once you've had them once, you're like, oh, okay, I could do that. I could do this again.
Exactly.
So that's really good. And yeah, we're always working on dialogues for things like post office, taxi, restaurant. If you're visualizing doing those things over and over again and being familiar with, just like you said, what might go wrong, what might I need to ask for, preparing in that way will help you just calm those feelings when you actually get to the real situation.
Yeah, and I love the idea of actually saying it out loud, because then your brain is also experiencing you as you move your mouth, your lips, your tongue.
Yeah.
And I know for many of us, myself included, you can kind of get the idea of it. In your mind, you can read a phrase and it seems really easy, but then when you actually use your mouth, it feels very different.
That is so true. That is so true. I used to always pretend I was a newsreader when I was learning Spanish and Portuguese at university. I'd read the news articles aloud and pretend that I was reading the news. So I was really paying attention.
None of us are surprised by this.
The blooming camera cut off before Therese could make her third and final point, so I wanted to add a little section in here to make sure that you get that important knowledge. Now this last tip is kind of a bit counterintuitive, but what she recommends is for you to actually think about what is the worst case scenario? What is the worst that could happen if you make a mistake or you're not understood? Because chances are that's never going to be what actually happens. So by visualizing and thinking about what the worst could happen is, you'll realize that perhaps some of your expectations as to what that might be may be completely ridiculous and never going to happen. Here's a quick example from my favorite show of all time, Ted Lasso, when Ted asks his assistant coach what he would say to the players in his position. Watch this.
I'm here.
No.
Why not? What are you afraid is going to happen if you tell me?
That you won't like my idea and it makes you hate me. Then you fire me, then I have to move back in with my parents and they'll be ashamed of me, and then everyone finds out back home and laughs at me until my face melts off. Excuse me.
So as you can see, sometimes some of the things that go on in our head have nothing to do with reality. So thinking about that and thinking, well, what's the worst that can happen, is a really good tip to be able to calm your nerves. Because I guess the truth is as well that adults do have more obstacles to learning, right? I mean, I'm putting myself in the shoes of people who are moving to Portugal and have all these other stress to contend with, maybe feeling lonely, have a bunch of other worries. That all plays a part too, right?
There's so much that we're dealing with as adults and in this world and in this day and age. And so I think it's fair to acknowledge that also if someone, for example, is dealing with real life anxiety or depression, going through a lot of life changes, right? Like moving countries, changing their whole world, everything's turning upside down, that if you're dealing with something like that, it's absolutely harder to take on something new, like a new language, because your brain is just more likely to be in that fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode as it's trying to find safety and stability. And so it's really worth acknowledging that if someone's struggling in that way, it's not just a matter of learning a few tips and tricks. They might need the help of a professional, a therapist, to help them get through those very real life challenges.
So I hope for you guys that are watching, this has given you some new perspective and some new tools that you can use to overcome these challenges. If you want to learn more from Therese, she has her own YouTube channel that I will link in the description, where she talks about all things mental health and how to build a life that you love that you don't need a vacation from. If you have some newfound confidence to get started with Portuguese after watching this video, watch this video next, or head to the description where I have a free lesson for beginners. I would love to see you there. I'll be back with a practical lesson next week. Ciao for now.